The galaxy was old. It had been spinning for billions of years, and in that time, thousands of species had learned to travel between the stars. They built empires, they fought wars, and eventually, they got tired of fighting and decided to talk instead. That was how the Galactic Concord was born, an alliance of over 4,000 spacefaring civilizations, all agreeing to follow a common set of rules so they could trade and argue and exist together without blowing each other up every few centuries. For 90,000 years, the Concord kept the peace, not perfectly, but well enough. Wars still happened, but they were small and controlled. Fleets of fast little warships would meet in the emptiness between stars and trade careful shots until one side decided it had lost enough ships. There were rules about who you could shoot and when, and most species followed them because breaking the rules meant the rest of the galaxy would come down on you like a hammer. But not every species liked rules. The Vraxians were insects. Not the small, harmless kind that crawled on garden walls. These were massive, armored creatures that stood 3 meters tall and fought with a hive mind controlled by a single queen. They called their nation the Vraxian Dominion, and they had been growing hungrier for territory with every passing decade. Their supreme hive commander, a creature called Vraxis the Undying, believed that the Concord was weak and soft, and that the galaxy belonged to the strong. He was right about one thing. The Concord was not ready for what came next. The Vraxian invasion started without warning. 14,000 warships poured across the border in a wave of chitin and plasma fire. They hit 3 Concord defense fleets in the first week and destroyed all of them. Colony worlds fell. Trade routes were cut. The Concord scrambled to respond, but the Vraxians were too fast, too many, and too brutal. They did not follow the accords of engagement. They bombed civilian cities. They burned farmland from orbit. They did not want territory. They wanted surrender. Within 2 months, the Vraxian fleet was pushing toward the galactic core, toward the Concord capital world of Selenith Prime. If Selenith fell, the Concord would die with it. Every species in the Alliance knew this, and none of them had enough ships left to stop it. It was in this desperate hour that Ambassador Talis Vor stood before the Concord High Senate and said something that made every diplomat in the chamber go very quiet. We should contact the humans. Talis was a Selenari, tall, silver-skinned, with 4 slender arms and eyes that changed color with her emotions. She was a scholar before she was a diplomat, and she had spent years studying old survey records that most species had forgotten existed. Records about a small blue world behind a line that no one was allowed to cross. The Pale Quarantine had been in place for nearly 9,000 years. Long ago, a Concord survey drone had entered the solar system of a young, violent species on the 3rd planet from their sun. The drone had watched them for a while, recorded their behavior, and sent back a report that made the Concord Survey Council very uncomfortable. The species was classified as a Category 9 adaptive predator, the highest danger rating ever given. They were tool users who had fought wars across their entire history. They ate other species. They modified their own environment with terrifying speed. They were creative in ways that scared the analysts, because they did not just solve problems. They invented entirely new ways to destroy things that had never existed before. The council voted to draw a 200 light-year exclusion zone around the species and never make contact. Every species in the Concord agreed. The zone was marked with warning beacons, and the small blue world was left alone. Over the centuries, humanity became a myth, a scary story that older species told younger ones. The Death Worlders, the caged predators. Most people believed they were still primitive, still stuck on their single planet, still burning dead plants for energy. Talis Vor did not believe this. She had read the old files more carefully than anyone, and she had noticed something that others had missed. The survey drone's final note, buried in a footnote, read, "Rate of technological advancement is anomalous. Recommend resurvey within 500 years." That resurvey had never happened. 9,000 years had passed, and no one had looked again. The Senate laughed at her proposal. One senator, a large reptilian creature from the Karathi system, said that asking primitives for help against the Vraxians was like asking a child to fight a forest fire. Another said that breaking the quarantine was illegal and dangerous. A third simply said, "They are animals. Let them stay in their cage." Talus left the Senate chamber with her hands shaking and her eyes burning gold with anger. She went to the diplomatic docks, stole a fast courier ship, and set a course for the Pale Quarantine. If the Senate would not act, she would. The journey took 11 days. She spent most of it reading everything she could find about humans, their history, their wars, their strange and violent art. She was frightened, but she was more frightened of what would happen to her homeworld if she did nothing. When her ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system, Talus expected to see a quiet, primitive star system. Maybe some basic satellites around the third planet. Maybe radio signals leaking out into space. What she actually saw made her stop breathing. The gas giants, the massive outer planets, were ringed with energy signatures so powerful that her instruments could not classify them. Enormous structures originated Jupiter and Saturn, each one larger than any space station the Concorde had ever built. The asteroid belt was not a belt anymore. It was organized, sorted, mined clean and rebuilt into something she did not understand. Before she could even begin to process what she was seeing, her ship jolted. An invisible hand grabbed her vessel and held it perfectly still. A gravitic tether, a technology the Concorde had theorized about but never built, had locked onto her hull and was pulling her gently but firmly toward the third planet. A voice came through her communications array. It was calm, polite, and spoke perfect galactic common with an accent she had never heard before. "Unidentified vessel, welcome to the Sol system. Please do not resist the tether. You will not be harmed. A representative will meet you shortly." Talus sat in her pilot's seat, staring at her instruments, and realized that the galaxy had made a terrible mistake. Humanity was not primitive. Humanity was not caged. Humanity had been sitting quietly in the dark for 9,000 years, watching, learning, and building something that the rest of the galaxy was not ready for. And she had just knocked on their door. The orbital station above Earth was not what Talus had imagined. She had expected something rough, something industrial and crude, the way young civilizations usually built their first structures in space. Instead, the station was beautiful. The corridors were wide and clean, lined with a warm golden light that seemed to come from the walls themselves. There were plants growing along the ceilings, real, living plants, and the air smelled fresh, like rain on warm stone. The humans who met her were smaller than she expected. They stood barely 2 meters tall, with soft skin and no natural armor, no claws, no venom glands. Looking at them, Talus could not understand how such fragile creatures had earned a Category 9 rating. Then she looked into their eyes and understood. There was something behind those eyes, a steadiness, a patience. The look of a predator that did not need to rush because it already knew it would win. The officer who greeted her was a man named Commander Kale Draenor. He was middle-aged by human standards, with short gray hair and a calm face that revealed nothing. He wore a simple dark uniform with a small emblem on his chest, a blue circle with a white star. He shook her hand gently, careful not to grip too hard, and said, "Ambassador Vor, we have been expecting someone like you for a long time." Talus blinked. "You know who I am?" "We know what is happening in the Concorde," Draenor said. "We have been listening to your transmissions for over 300 years. We learned your languages. We studied your wars. We watched the Vraxians build their fleet. He paused. We wondered when someone would come asking for help. Over the next 2 days, Draenor gave Talis a carefully controlled tour of what humanity had built during its long silence. What she saw broke every assumption she had ever held about this species. Humanity had discovered faster-than-light travel over 3 centuries ago. They had found the quarantine beacons at the edge of their exclusion zone, decoded them, and read the files the Concord had written about them. They had read the words, Category 9 Adaptive Predator, and Permanent Non-Contact Recommended. They had read the fear in every line. And then they had made a choice that Talis found almost impossible to believe. They stayed. Not because they could not leave. Not because they were afraid. They stayed because they understood what would happen if they suddenly appeared in a galaxy that had spent 9,000 years being terrified of them. There would be panic. There would be war. Species would unite against them out of pure fear, and billions would die. So humanity decided to wait. They would not enter the galaxy until they were invited. But waiting did not mean sitting still. They turned their solar system into a fortress. They mined the asteroids and built stations around every planet. They developed technologies that the Concord had never even imagined. Gravity manipulation, self-repairing materials, artificial intelligence systems so advanced that they could think and adapt in real time. They studied every Concord transmission they intercepted. They learned every species' tactics, every weapon system, every strength and weakness. And then they built a ship. Draenor took Talis to the orbital construction yards above Mars. The shuttle approached a massive dry dock, and the viewport shutters opened slowly. Talis looked out and felt her legs go weak. The ship filled the entire viewport. It was so large that her mind struggled to understand what she was seeing. 12 kilometers long. The largest warship the Concord had ever built was 800 meters, and that was considered a giant. This thing was not a warship. It was a floating city made for war. Its hull was covered in an alloy so dark that it seemed to swallow light. Talis could see weapon systems along its surface, rows and rows of them, but her instruments could not identify most of them. There were structures she did not recognize, openings that could have been hangars or weapon ports or something else entirely. The ship did not look like it had been designed. It looked like it had been grown, like some terrible dark flower that had bloomed in the silence of human isolation. "We call her the Terraform Wrath," Draenor said quietly. He explained what the ship could do, and with every sentence, Talis felt the galaxy she thought she knew get smaller and more fragile. The Terraform Wrath did not carry a fleet of smaller ships like Concord warships did. It carried war forges, automated factories built into its hull that could manufacture, arm, and launch thousands of combat drones in minutes. Each drone was controlled by an adaptive intelligence that could learn and adjust its tactics mid-battle. Its main weapon was something called a gravity lance. It compressed space itself into a cutting edge and could slice a capital ship in half from 40,000 kilometers away. Its secondary weapon was a kinetic spine cannon that ran the entire length of the ship and could fire a solid tungsten rod at 80% of the speed of light. At that velocity, the impact would release more energy than a nuclear bomb. Its point defense systems could track and destroy 10,000 incoming projectiles at the same time. Its hull could repair itself using tiny machines that lived inside the metal and rebuilt damage in seconds. It had shields, but Draenor admitted the ship rarely needed them. Talis stared at the dark shape through the viewport and asked the question that was burning in her throat. Why only one ship? If you can build this, you could build 1,000. You could build a fleet that would make the Vraxians look like insects. Draenor looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something behind his calm expression. It was not pride. It was sadness. "We could have," he said. "That is exactly the point. We built one ship because one ship is enough. We did not want to become the thing the galaxy was afraid of." Talus understood then. The terraform wrath was not just a weapon, it was a message. It said, we could have built an armada that would have conquered every star in the galaxy. We chose to build just enough to protect, not to dominate. She presented her case formally the next day, standing before the United Earth Parliament in a great hall in a city called Geneva. She told them about Selenith Prime, about the billions of people who would die, about the Vraxians and their cruelty. She told them that the galaxy had wronged humanity, that the quarantine had been unjust and born from fear, but that none of that mattered now because innocent people were dying and humanity had the power to stop it. The Parliament debated for 6 hours. Some members were angry. They said the galaxy had locked humanity away like dangerous animals and did not deserve help. Others said that helping would only make the galaxy fear them more. The arguments went back and forth, and Talus sat in the gallery above and felt hope draining from her chest. Then an old woman stood up at the back of the chamber. She was small and white-haired, and she leaned on a cane. But when she spoke, every person in the room went silent. 9,000 years ago, they looked at us and saw monsters, she said. They were afraid of what we might become. They were not entirely wrong to be afraid. We are dangerous. We know this about ourselves better than anyone. But we also know something they do not. We know that what makes us dangerous is the same thing that makes us capable of great kindness. We feel deeply, we fight hard, and we protect the things we love with everything we have. She looked around the chamber. They feared what we might become. I say we show them what we chose to be. The vote was held 30 minutes later. It was not even close. The next morning, the terraform Wrath detached from its dock above Mars. Its engines lit up with a deep blue fire that could be seen from Earth's surface. Talus stood on the command bridge beside Commander Draenor as the massive ship turned its nose toward the stars. Draenor looked at his crew, took a quiet breath, and said, "Take us out." The terraform Wrath jumped to faster-than-light speed and left the solar system behind. For the first time in 9,000 years, a human ship crossed the quarantine line. The galaxy was not ready. The first sensor station to detect the terraform Wrath was a small Concord monitoring post on the edge of the quarantine zone. The two technicians on duty, both from a small, nervous species called the Willikai, were halfway through their evening meal when every alarm in the station screamed at once. They stared at their screens. A single contact had crossed the quarantine line, moving at a speed their instruments could barely track. The energy signature was unlike anything in the Concord database. It was enormous. It was wrong. It did not match any known ship class, any known power source, or any known civilization. One technician looked at the other and said, very quietly, "The humans are out." Within an hour, the alert had reached every major government in the Concord. Emergency sessions were called on 100 worlds. Military commanders pulled their officers out of bed. Civilians who happened to be watching the news saw a single blinking red dot on a galactic map, moving steadily inward from the pale quarantine, and felt a cold fear settle into their stomachs. 9,000 years of silence, and now something was coming. Talus had transmitted ahead. She had sent messages on every frequency she could reach, explaining what was happening, that she had contacted the humans, that they were coming to help, that they were allies, not invaders. Some believed her. Most did not. The fear of humanity was too old, too deep, woven into the cultural memory of thousands of species, like a scar that never fully healed. Many senators openly accused Talus of treason. Others said she had been taken prisoner and that the humans were using her to trick the Concorde into lowering its guard. On the bridge of the terraform Wrath, Commander Draenor watched the panicked transmission scroll across his communication screens and said nothing. He had expected this. Every human on that ship had expected this. They had lived their entire lives knowing that the galaxy was afraid of them. And now they were flying straight into the heart of that fear. Talus stood beside him, her silver skin pale and her eyes cycling through shades of anxious blue. "They think you are coming to conquer them," she said. "I know," Draenor replied. "They will learn otherwise. But first, we have a more immediate problem." He pointed to the tactical display. A detachment of 300 Vraxian warships had broken away from the main invasion fleet and was on an intercept course. They would arrive in less than 2 hours. The Vraxians had been monitoring Concorde transmissions too, and when Supreme Hive Commander Vraxis heard about a single ship crossing the quarantine line, he had been amused. He called the humans a curiosity and sent 300 ships to deal with them. It was a casual gesture, like swatting a fly with a rolled-up newspaper. He did not even bother to send his best commanders. That was his first mistake. The Vraxian detachment dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a wide sphere around the terraform Wrath, surrounding it from every direction. 300 ships, each one bristling with plasma cannons and missile racks, each one carrying a crew of Vraxian warriors hungry for blood. Against them stood one ship. A big ship, yes, but still just one. The Vraxian fleet commander broadcast a message in rough galactic common. "Unknown vessel, you are surrounded. Power down your weapons and surrender your crew for processing. You have 30 seconds. The terraform Wrath was silent. 10 seconds passed. 20. The Vraxian crews shifted nervously at their stations. Something about that silence felt wrong. It was not the silence of a ship that was afraid. It was the silence of something that was deciding. Then Commander Draenor opened a channel. His voice was calm and even, almost gentle, like a parent warning a child not to touch a hot stove. "Vraxian fleet, this is Commander Kale Draenor of the United Earth Navy vessel Terraform Wrath. You have 60 seconds to withdraw from this area. This is your only warning. There will not be a second one." The Vraxian commander laughed. It was a harsh, clicking sound that echoed across the open channel. Then he gave the order to fire. 300 ships fired at once. Thousands of plasma lances lit up the darkness. Missile volleys erupted from every angle, streaking toward the terraform Wrath in a storm of fire and light. It was enough firepower to crack the crust of a small moon. None of it hit. The terraform Wrath's point defense grid activated. It was not a shield in the way the Concorde understood shields. It was something faster, smarter, more precise. Thousands of tiny turrets along the hull moved with a speed that should not have been possible, each one targeting an incoming projectile, each one firing a needle-thin beam of energy that vaporized its target at a distance of 1 kilometer. The space around the ship became a sphere of flickering white light, as every single shot, every single missile, was destroyed before it could touch the hull. The first volley achieved nothing. The Vraxians stared at their screens in confusion. Sensors showed 0 hits, 0, against 300 ships firing at once. Then the terraform Wrath fired back. The gravity lance activated. There was no sound in space, but every sensor in the area screamed, as the fabric of space itself was compressed into a blade, a line of distorted gravity so intense that it cut through matter like a hot wire through ice. The lance swept horizontally across the Vraxian formation in a single smooth arc. 47 ships were cut in half. They did not explode immediately. For a brief, horrible moment, the two halves of each ship simply drifted apart, the insides glowing red and white where the cut had melted through bulkheads and armor and crew. Then the atmosphere inside each broken hull ignited, and 47 flowers of fire bloomed silently in the dark. The remaining Vraxian ships panicked. Discipline broke. Some tried to flee. Others tried to close the distance, hoping that getting close enough would make the gravity lance useless. They were wrong about that. The war forges opened. Hatches along the terraform Wrath's hull slid apart, and from inside the ship poured a swarm of combat drones, thousands of them, each one the size of a small fighter, each one controlled by an intelligence that could think and react faster than any living pilot. They spread out like a cloud of dark insects, and fell upon the Vraxian fleet with terrible precision. Each drone identified the weakest point of the nearest enemy ship and struck it there. Shield generators were targeted first. Once the shields fell, the drones hit the engines. Once the engines died, the ships were helpless. The drones did not waste shots. They did not miss. They learned from each kill, and used that knowledge on the next target. Some Vraxian ships managed to land hits on the drones, but for every drone destroyed, 2 more launched from the war forges. The factory inside the terraform Wrath was building new drones faster than the Vraxians could destroy them. The entire engagement lasted 90 seconds. When it was over, all 300 Vraxian ships were either destroyed or drifting dead in space, their hulls dark, their weapons cold. The terraform Wrath had not taken a single point of damage. Its hull did not even have a scratch. Commander Draenor looked at the tactical display, confirmed the area was clear, and said, "Resume course." The terraform Wrath's engines fired, and the great dark ship moved forward without slowing down, leaving behind a field of broken Vraxian metal that slowly spun and cooled in the void. Across the galaxy, every species that had been monitoring the battle watched the sensor data in disbelief. Military analysts replayed the footage frame by frame. They counted the seconds. They measured the energy output. They tried to find some trick, some weakness, some explanation for what they had just witnessed. They found nothing. It was exactly what it looked like. One ship had destroyed 300 warships in less than 2 minutes without taking any damage at all. The Concord Senate fell silent. The Vraxian High Command went quiet. On 1,000 worlds, military officers looked at each other with the same expression. The wide-eyed, hollow look of people who had just realized that everything they understood about power and war and the balance of the galaxy had been wrong. On the bridge of the terraform Wrath, Talis Vor sat in the observer's chair and watched the stars streak past. Her hands were trembling. She had asked for help, and help had come. But she was only now beginning to understand what she had invited into the galaxy. She looked at Draenor. He was reviewing tactical reports as calmly as if he had just finished a training exercise. "Commander," she said quietly, "that was 300 ships." "Yes," he said. "The Vraxian main fleet has 12,000. Draenor looked up from his reports. There was no fear in his eyes, no worry, just that same steady patience she had seen on the first day she met him. "I know," he said. Selenith Prime was dying. The planet hung in space like a jewel. Blue oceans, silver cities, green forests that stretched across whole continents. It was the most beautiful world in the Concord. It was also the capital, home to the High Senate, the diplomatic courts, and over 9 billion Selenari civilians. For 90,000 years, it had been the heart of galactic civilization. Now it was surrounded. 12,000 Vraxian warships filled the space around the planet, in a sphere of dark metal and flickering weapons. They had arrived 3 days ago, smashing through the last Concord defense fleet like a fist through glass. What remained of that fleet, less than 400 battered ships, held a thin, desperate line between the Vraxian armada and the planet below. They were outgunned. They were outmatched. Every commander knew they could not hold for more than a few hours. On the surface, 9 billion people, huddled in underground shelters. Children cried. Parents held them and tried to stay calm. The sky above was filled with the distant flashes of weapons fire, like a terrible storm that never ended. Supreme Hive Commander Vraxis sat aboard his flagship, the Endless Hunger, and watched the planet with the cold satisfaction of a predator that had cornered its prey. He was in no hurry. The Concord fleet was broken. No reinforcements were coming. He wanted the Selenari to feel every minute of their fear before he began the bombardment. He wanted them to understand that their alliance, their rules, their precious Concord meant nothing against true power. His officers had told him about the human ship. They had shown him the sensor data from the detachment it had destroyed. Vraxis had studied the footage carefully. 300 ships gone in 90 seconds. It was impressive, he admitted. But 300 was not 12,000. One ship, no matter how powerful, could not fight an entire armada. The mathematics were simple. He was wrong about that, but he would not learn this for several more hours. The first sign that something had changed came when the long-range sensors of every ship in the system detected a single faster-than-light signature approaching from the galactic west. One contact, one ship, moving at a speed that made the sensor officers frown and check their instruments twice. The terraform Wrath dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Selenith system and came to a stop. For a moment, nothing happened. The massive dark ship simply hung in space, its hull drinking the light of Selenith's star, its weapons cold, its engines quiet. Then it broadcast a message on every frequency, in every language the Concord had ever recorded. The voice was Commander Draenar's, and it was as calm as still water. This world is under the protection of the United Earth Navy. All hostile vessels will withdraw immediately. This is not a request. Across the Vraxian fleet, 12,000 crews heard the message. On the battered Concord ships, exhausted officers lifted their heads from their consoles and stared at their screens. On the surface of Selenith Prime, the broadcast was picked up by civilian radios, and 9 billion people heard a human voice for the first time. Vraxis clicked his mandibles in amusement and opened a return channel. "One ship," he said. "You bring one ship to challenge the Dominion. I admire your courage, human, but courage does not win wars. Numbers win wars. You are outnumbered 12,000 to 1. Draenar's reply was brief. "Then it is almost a fair fight." Vraxis gave the order. The entire Vraxian armada turned toward the terraform Wrath and attacked. What happened next would be studied by military historians for 10,000 years. They would call it the Battle of Selenith Prime. They would argue about tactics and technology and the nature of power. But every account, no matter how detailed or how analytical, would agree on one thing. It was the most one-sided battle in the history of the galaxy, and it was not the side with 12,000 ships that won. The Warforges activated first. 8,000 combat drones poured out of the terraform Wrath's hull in a swarm so dense that it looked like the ship was breathing out a cloud of darkness. The drones spread across the battlefield in patterns that no Vraxian commander could predict, because the patterns were being generated and adjusted by an artificial intelligence that thought 1,000 times faster than any organic brain. The drones, the outer ring of the Vraxian fleet, like a wave crashing against rocks. But these rocks shattered. The drones had already analyzed every piece of Vraxian technology from the earlier engagement. They knew where the shield generators were. They knew the exact frequency needed to overload them. They knew that Vraxian engine cores had a 2-second vulnerability window during power cycling. They exploited every weakness with cold mechanical precision. Ships began to die. 10, 20, 100. The Vraxians fought back with everything they had, destroying drones by the dozen, but the Warforges kept building more. For every drone that fell, another launched. The swarm did not shrink, it grew. Then the gravity lance fired. The blade of compressed space swept through the heart of the Vraxian formation, cutting through ships as if they were made of paper. The lance did not distinguish between large ships and small ships, between flagships and supply vessels. Everything in its path was sliced apart with the same terrible ease. 200 ships died in the first sweep, 300 in the second. Vraxis screamed orders at his fleet. He commanded them to spread out, to make the formation too wide for the lance to cut through. The Vraxian ships obeyed, stretching their sphere thinner, trying to surround the human ship from every angle at once. It was the standard Vraxian response to a powerful enemy. Overwhelm it with numbers, attack from all sides, find the blind spots. The terraform Wrath did not have blind spots. Its point defense grid covered every centimeter of the hull. Its sensors tracked every ship, every missile, every piece of debris in the entire system simultaneously. When the Vraxians spread out, the drones simply adjusted their patterns and hunted them down in smaller groups. The kinetic spine cannon fired for the first time. A rod of solid tungsten, 2 meters long and half a meter wide, was accelerated down the entire 12-kilometer length of the ship and launched at 80% of the speed of light. It struck the Vraxian flagship, the Endless Hunger, dead center. The rod punched through the forward shields as if they did not exist. It passed through the outer hull, through 12 decks of crew quarters, through the command bridge, through the engine core, and out the other side. The entry wound was a perfect circle 2 meters wide. The exit wound was a crater 50 meters across, surrounded by molten metal that glowed white-hot. The Endless Hunger did not explode. It simply stopped functioning, like a body with its heart torn out, and began to drift. Vraxis survived. He was not on the command bridge when the shot hit. He was in the secondary command center, deeper inside the ship, and he felt the impact like an earthquake. Alarms screamed around him. His officers shouted damage reports in panicked, clicking voices. Half the ship was dead. The other half was dying. If he could not win this battle, he would make sure the humans did not win either. He opened a fleet-wide channel and gave his final order. All remaining ships were to ignore the human vessel and fire everything they had at the planet below. If Selenith Prime burned, it did not matter if the Vraxians died with it. The Concorde would still lose its heart. 2,000 surviving Vraxian ships turned away from the terraform Wrath and aimed their weapons at the planet. The terraform Wrath moved. It should not have been possible for something that large to move that fast. But the ship's gravity drives bent space around its hull, and it crossed the distance between itself and the planet in seconds, placing its massive body between the Vraxian guns and Selenith Prime. Then it did something that no one had ever seen before. The ship activated a system that Draenor had hoped he would never need to use. A planetary shield, a projection field that extended outward from the hull in a dome large enough to cover the entire world behind it. The energy cost was staggering. Lights dimmed across the ship. Non-essential systems shut down. The warforges slowed, then stopped. The drones that were still fighting began to run out of coordination as processing power was diverted to maintaining the shield. The Vraxian bombardment hit the shield with everything they had. Plasma fire, nuclear missiles, kinetic rounds, all of it hammered against the shimmering barrier above Selenith Prime. The terraform Wrath shuddered. Hull plates cracked. For the first time in the battle, the ship was taking real damage. Draenor gripped the edge of his command console as the deck shook beneath his feet. Talus, strapped into the observer's chair, watched in horror. "The shield is failing," she whispered. Draenor looked at her. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard. He turned to his weapons officer and said 2 words that would become the most famous words in galactic history. "Deploy the Ender." A single projectile launched from the spine cannon. It was not tungsten. It was small, no larger than a fist, and it was wrapped in magnetic containment fields, so complex that it had taken humanity 50 years to build one. Inside that tiny shell was a contained gravitational singularity, a black hole, held in perfect balance, waiting to be released. The projectile reached the center of the remaining Vraxian formation and detonated. The singularity bloomed. Gravity twisted. Space screamed. Every ship within 1,000 kilometers was pulled inward with a force that no engine could resist. Metal crumpled. Hulls collapsed. Ships that had survived the entire battle were crushed like insects in a closing fist. The singularity burned for exactly 4 seconds. It had been designed to collapse after a set duration, so it would not become a permanent danger. But 4 seconds was enough. When it faded, 1,800 Vraxian warships had been reduced to a spinning disk of compressed debris, glowing red and orange like a dying ember. Vraxis the Undying died somewhere inside that disk. His ship, already crippled, was pulled in with the rest. The last thing the Supreme Hive Commander ever saw was the walls of his command center bending inward like wet paper. The silence that followed the Battle of Selenith Prime was the loudest silence the galaxy had ever known. The terraform Wrath hung in orbit above the planet it had saved, battered and scarred, but still whole. Long cracks ran along its dark hull where the Vraxian bombardment had struck during the shield deployment. Sections of the outer armor glowed faintly where repair systems were already working to close the wounds. Thin trails of vapor leaked from damaged compartments, freezing into tiny crystals that sparkled in the starlight. Below the ship, Selenith Prime turned slowly in the light of its sun. The silver cities still stood. The green forests still spread across the continents. 9 billion people were alive because of what had happened in the last 3 hours. Across the galaxy, trillions of beings sat in front of their screens and tried to understand what they had just witnessed. Sensor logs from the battle were transmitted, copied, shared, and replayed on every world that had the technology to receive them. Military analysts went through the data second by second. They counted the Vraxian losses, over 12,000 ships destroyed. They measured the terraform Wrath's energy output and found numbers that their models said were impossible. They studied the gravity lance, the drone swarms, the kinetic cannon, and the weapon that everyone was already calling the Ender. And they realized that each one of these systems, on its own, was more advanced than anything the Concord had ever produced. And this was just one ship. One single ship from a species that had been building in silence for 300 years. The fear that followed was different from the fear that had come before. The old fear of humanity had been abstract, a cautious worry about what the Death Worlders might become someday. This new fear was real and sharp, and based on hard evidence. Every species in the galaxy understood, with perfect clarity, that if humanity wanted to conquer the Milky Way, there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. The Vraxians had been the greatest military threat the Concord had ever faced, and the humans had swatted them aside like annoying insects. The question that echoed through every Senate chamber, every war room, every quiet conversation on every world was simple. What do they want? Commander Draenor answered that question 3 days later, when he was invited to address the Concord High Senate on Selenith Prime. It was the first time a human had ever set foot in the Senate chamber, and the room was packed beyond capacity. Thousands of diplomats and officials filled every seat, and billions more watched through holofeeds on worlds scattered across the galaxy. Draenor arrived with a small escort, just 4 officers in simple dark uniforms. No armor, no show of force. Talis Vor walked beside him, her silver skin shining under the chamber lights, her eyes a steady, warm gold. She had argued for days to be allowed to introduce him, and the Senate had finally agreed. She stepped up to the podium, and looked out at the vast chamber. Every eye was on her. Every sensor was recording. 3 weeks ago, she said, I stole a ship and broke the oldest law in the Concord. I crossed the pale quarantine because I believed, against all advice and all common wisdom, that the species on the other side of that line might be willing to help us. I was terrified. Every story I had ever heard about humanity told me they were monsters. She paused. I was wrong. What I found was a civilization that had every reason to hate us, and chose not to. A people who had been locked away for 9,000 years, and spent that time not building weapons of revenge, but building the capacity to protect others. I asked them for help, and they came. They did not ask for payment. They did not ask for territory. They came because it was the right thing to do. She stepped aside, and Commander Draenor took her place at the podium. He was shorter than most of the aliens in the room. He had no impressive physical features, no armor plates, no glowing eyes, no towering height. He looked small and soft and ordinary. And yet, when he began to speak, the entire chamber went so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop on the far side of the room. 9,000 years ago, he said, you looked at us and saw monsters. You drew a line around our world and told the galaxy to forget we existed. I will not stand here and tell you that you were wrong to be afraid. You were right. We are dangerous. We are perhaps the most dangerous species this galaxy has ever produced. We know this about ourselves. We have always known it. He paused and looked around the chamber. His eyes moved from face to face, species to species, and every being he looked at felt for just a moment the weight of his gaze. But dangerous does not mean evil, he continued. The same fire that burns a forest can also warm a home. The same hands that can build weapons can also build bridges. You isolated us because you feared what we might become. What you did not consider is that we might choose what to become. And we did choose. We chose to wait. We chose to watch. We chose to build not an armada of conquest, but a single ship of protection. We could have filled the stars with warships. We built one. I hope you understand what that means. He let the words settle. Then he spoke his final line, and it was the line that would be carved into monuments and taught to children for generations to come. We did not come here to rule. We came because someone asked for help. That is the species we chose to be. The chamber was silent for a long time. Then, Talis Vor stood up from her seat in the front row and began to clap. It was a human gesture. She had learned it on Earth, and for a moment, no one else in the chamber understood what she was doing. Then a Karathi senator stood and joined her, pressing his clawed hands together in his own species' sign of respect. Then another senator stood. Then another. Within a minute, the entire chamber was on its feet, and the sound of 4,000 species expressing gratitude and awe in 4,000 different ways filled the great hall like thunder. In the days that followed, the Concord formally and permanently dissolved the pale quarantine. The warning beacons were shut down. For the first time in 9,000 years, the space around Earth's solar system was open. The Senate offered humanity a full seat on the High Council, the highest honor the Concord could give. Draenor, after consulting with the Parliament back on Earth, politely declined. Humanity would accept observer status instead. They would attend sessions, offer advice when asked, and help where they could. But they would not vote on matters of galactic governance. Not yet. When asked why, Draenor said simply, "We have been alone for a very long time. We need to learn how to be neighbors before we try to be leaders." The Vraxian Dominion collapsed within weeks. Without Vraxis the Undying, and without a fleet, the hive mind fractured into thousands of smaller groups that fought each other as much as they fought anyone else. Occupied worlds were liberated. Refugees returned home. The scars of the invasion would take decades to heal, but the healing had begun. Slowly, carefully, other species began sending delegations to Earth. They came expecting to find a world of warriors, grim, hardened, obsessed with weapons and war. What they found surprised them more than anything else in this entire story. Vast, beautiful gardens that covered the surface of Mars, where humans had turned a dead world into a living one. They found music, orchestras performing in orbital habitats, the sound carrying through halls with perfect acoustics. They found children laughing in parks, artists painting in studios, scientists debating in universities. They found a species that had poured its restless, dangerous energy not only into weapons, but into beauty, into knowledge, into life. The fear did not disappear overnight. It would take years, maybe generations, for the galaxy to fully trust humanity. Some species might never manage it entirely. But the fear was changing. It was softening at the edges, mixing with something warmer. And for some, something that felt very much like hope. The hope that if a species as dangerous as humanity could choose kindness, then maybe the galaxy was not as dark a place as everyone had believed. On the last day before the terraform Wrath departed for Earth, Talis Vor visited the ship one final time. She found Commander Draenor alone on an observation deck at the top of the vessel, standing in front of a wide viewport that looked out at the stars. The deck was quiet. The lights were dim. Selenith Prime glowed softly below them, alive and whole and safe. Talis stood beside him for a while, without speaking. They had become something like friends over the past few weeks. An unlikely pair, the silver-skinned diplomat and the quiet human commander, bound together by an experience that neither of them would ever be able to fully explain to anyone else. Finally, she asked the question that had been sitting in her mind since the day she first saw the terraform Wrath in its dock above Mars. Do you think they will ever truly stop being afraid of us? Draenor was quiet for a long time. He watched the stars, the vast, ancient, endless stars that humanity had stared at for all of its history. And when he spoke, his voice was soft. Probably not, he said. But that is all right. Fear fades. What matters is what we do while they are watching. The terraform Wrath turned toward home the next morning. Its engines lit up with that deep blue fire, and the great dark ship moved away from Selenith Prime, away from the Concord, away from the galaxy that had feared it and was now, for the first time, grateful for its existence. Talis watched it go from the window of her apartment in the capital city. She watched until the blue light faded into the stars and the ship was gone. Then she sat down at her desk, opened a blank document, and began to write. She wrote about a small blue world behind a quarantine line. She wrote about a species that the galaxy had called monsters. She wrote about the day they arrived, and how the galaxy shuddered in fear, and how that fear had slowly, carefully, begun to turn into something better. She titled the document with 6 words that would become the opening line of the most widely read book in galactic history. They came because we asked.